you know, she made some kind of a statement, I can't remember what it was at the time, that suggested that she understood that I knew her background and that she understood there was something we weren't to talk about, and she more or less apologized about her line and level of work. The details by which she did so were an open door to throw what's in truth a modest question with profound implications. It's one of my pet responses to people who are opposed one way or another to the very idea that you could perfect an economy. People often assert that that would be impossible, or that the present systems are somehow justified. And mind you now, from the late 1960s, 1968, through actually to the earlier mid-1990s, no one readily concurred with this idea that there was something wrong with the nature of the currency, that it had terminal effects, as I had produced a mathematic proof of, and people would generally scoff at the idea that the economy would fail. Although, if you trace this entire period of time, you can, from the very data that was regularly exposed to all of us, you can see a profound escalating degeneration of prosperity in relation to the production of the people. So anyway, when she made this apology in our initial introductions, and she was a very polite woman, easy to get along with, we shook hands, and she more or less, would say condescended that there were grave, faults. Evidently, the people that put us together sort of primed her. If he ever brings this up, you slap him around, and that wasn't her disposition or something like that. And so anyway, in response to these details that she offered up, I sort of chuckled, and we were still shaking hands, and I said, it's amazing you say that, because I've been doing what I do for years, and to this point in time, no one has ever provided a plausible explanation or retort that it's even possible to maintain a vital circulation subject to interest without perpetually multiplying artificial indebtedness in proportion to a circulation or remaining capacity to pay, until you would ultimately suffer inevitably terminal sums of artificial debt.
Yeah.
And she just quickened, and she studied me directly in the eye the whole time that I was uttering this, which is ultimately a profound statement with unequivocal, proven mathematic basis. And so what happened, her jaw sort of dropped, and she says, explain this idea to me. And so here I am being invited to do what I've been advised, don't you dare ever do this. Right like that, right like that, we're in the middle of it. So anyway, I end up explaining to her that that I had published this thesis in '79, and originally, had just spoken it off the top of my head to a to an economics teacher in 1968, and that basically this idea of mathematically perfected economy is a two-part thesis. One, that any purported economy subject to interest-bearing debt ultimately terminates itself under insoluble debt. And secondly, that there is one and one only solution to the potential categoric faults of any economy. And so how the first part of the thesis works, I told her, was that when the money is introduced to circulation as a debt subject to interest, it becomes, it's implicitly, there's an implicit obligation to maintain a vital circulation, because what we call a debt is not the debt. What we call a debt wrongly just refers to the principal. The principal is all that can ever remain in circulation at any given time, because only the principal is what's introduced to circulation. And yet the debt, or obligation as I've preferred to call it for 40 years, the obligation is to pay the principal and interest out of circulation. And generally, because the purported banking system cannot possibly absorb in our production so much interest as we're periodic interest as we're paying out of circulation in servicing in any initial instances of debt. This means that the sum of artificial indebtedness increases at even an inherently escalating rate of ever greater sums of periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt.
Yeah, as it has.
Yes. Well, in fact, I provided. We'll get to this next, and we'll come back to Reagan, because I'm answering the question whether or not I thought Reagan understood this. Well, so I explained to her that, as I explained to everyone who has a question about this, excuse me again, that the fact that you have to reborrow principal to maintain what a vital circulation against what principal you're paying out of circulation means that any subsequent principal that you borrow back into circulation comprises a new debt equal to the former debt, making it mathematically impossible to pay down the sum of debt. You know, and her eyebrows are going up a little bit more all the time, as if, well, she's really hearing something which is profound and right on the money, you know. And so then I say, but on the other hand, whatever interest you're paying out of circulation never counted against the former sum of debt. Therefore, it doesn't reduce the former sum of debt at all. But as we have to borrow that back into circulation, that effort to maintain a vital circulation comprises new debt. Thus, the sum of debt is increased by so much as periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt, until at an even inherently escalating rates, we inevitably suffer a terminal sum of debt, which exceeds our capacity to service it. In other words, the entire circulation would ultimately be dedicated to servicing this terminal sum of debt in what I call the maximum possible lifespan of any economy based on interest-bearing debt. It actually dies at its maximum practical lifespan, excuse me again, which is somewhat short of that, because what happens is some of the industry is compelled to service this debt. It's the engine of production and earning, which the costs of servicing this ever escalating sum of debt are saddled upon. And so, in order to sustain the system, you also have to have enough circulation which is free to sustaining the industry, which is saddled with this obligation. So the maximum practical lifespan of any such system is a point at which you reach when the sum of debt is multiplied until the cost of servicing it infringe upon what portions of circulation would have to be dedicatable to sustaining industry. So we've actually passed this point in time at this point in this system.
When was that point?
When was that point? Actually, it was around, earlier in this decade, the early half of this decade in there. It's something that we can't really say this is exactly it, because what happens is the economy is as we falsely call it, and I refer to it only so people know what I'm talking about. But this isn't to know what we're talking about unless we understand all these things. It's not an economy then. It's in fact a process which has never been justified, and which in fact can only multiply artificial costliness on us. In other words, it's the antithesis of economy. What we have here. It's nothing but a system of exploitation. Its purported principles have never been justified. We claim that, who would loan us money if it weren't subject to interest? But the question remains, are we borrowing money at all? Did all this money always exist? How does it come into circulation? But as a promissory obligation. Are we truly borrowing it from banks, or are banks actually just merely publishing evidence of our promissory obligations to each other? And what is the natural? What are the natural principles of a promissory obligation? What is the obligation to do? How do you preserve the integrity of the promissory obligation and the resultant currency? These are simple questions to answer, and I answered them many years ago. And in fact, none of my adversaries have ever disproven mathematically perfected economy. If you've ever been to my pages, you know, for instance, that G. Edward Griffin, for instance, Austrian economist, advocate of interest. I imagine you're at least, generally familiar with, the assertions of Austrian economists. Hayek, actually comes right out in his paper, so-called, it's not a paper, actually it was a speech he gave, which has been presented at von Mises as a paper, for many years. But, he comes right out and declares, why they're advocates of banking, and that is because banking can be, quote, can be, he says, it inevitably is, but he says it can be an extremely profitable business, unquote. Anyway, so I'm presenting just a general idea of interest being a cause of terminal failure to this woman, and I finish explaining that once the sum of artificial indebtedness infringes upon our capacity, the remaining capacity to sustain industry, because we're paying so much of the circulation out of circulation and servicing the debt, that what remains in any period of time to dedicate to sustaining industry isn't sufficient to sustain the industry, which is compelled to service all this debt.
And can you draw a difference between interest on money created and an economy under a fixed money supply, where money was created debt-free, and simply an institution lending on some of that existing money supply for interest?
Actually, I explored all the ramifications of these issues, 42 and 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And if you trace the history of monetary reform, you will find no one before me who really, there were people that may have said, well, it's not sustainable, it will fail. But no one ever showed how or proved that the failure was inevitable. And now today, 40 years later, it's even customary for people to use terms which I know you even use in your interview with Bill Stills, to say inevitable failure. inevitable collapse. Catastrophic failure, that's another term that I introduced. Obfuscation of the currency.